Do you know this album's turning 30 this month? That's neat. Anyways, let's talk about it. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's Jean-Michel Jarre's Revolutions. This is an interesting point in the Jarre catalog. I think this album is kind of similar to his earlier album, Magnetic Fields. He wanted to try and bring some new twists to his usual style, but he couldn't settle on just one, and the result was a bit of a mishmash. Though at least this time, Jarre didn't try to pretend this wasn't the case. This album breaks his usual trend of not giving any tracks actual titles and naming them as parts of the same whole. Well, Zuluk did this too, but ironically that worked much better as a whole than Magnetic Fields did. Revolutions, though, is probably his least cohesive or consistent project, I think, even to this day. Even Electronica won the Time Machine, an album that one moment could have me jamming out to what may very well be Armin van Buuren's best work, but just a few moments earlier was making me cringe at Pete Townsend telling me to move my feet to the beat. I did not berate that track enough in my review, good god. But at least that album had a well-defined concept tying everything together, and I can still say the vast majority of the tracks there were enjoyable in some way, because it had 16 tracks, and any of the bad moments could be made up for by at least 3 or 4 different good to great tracks surrounding it. Revolutions only has 7 tracks, a lot less room for error, so the presence of mediocre tracks on here becomes less excusable. That said, it's also kind of conflicting because the high points on this album are among the highest of his entire career. I know for a fact that despite its inconsistency, this video won't mark the last time I listen to this stuff. Revolutions is an album with both some of his worst material and some of his all-time best. I mean, it is easily the biggest mixed bag he's ever released. Right down to the title, which if you take it at face value is kind of a lie, because there's nothing really revolutionary or game-changing happening here. This is Jarre finding unique spins on his usual style. Fun, he's pushing himself, but not the genre. It's not game-changing. To be fair, I think the album was actually named after, actual revolutions in history dedicated to other people moving ahead of the future, not so much Jarre doing so himself. But whatever, let's talk about individual tracks. So, the first track, Industrial Revolution, is a 4-part suite. There's an overture, which doesn't sound like the rest, but fits thematically, and parts 1, 2, and 3, which are distinguishable from each other, but they're all basically the same track. And this entire piece, which I tend to treat as one track, is by far the highlight of the album, and one of my favorite tracks that Jarre's ever made. The overture itself, as I said, fits thematically with the title of the track, starts out with some mechanical-sounding percussion and brings in a bunch of dramatic synth pads that sound like strings, a setting that is all over this album, by the way, as well as some more overtly 80s synth leads, really sounding big and epic, but nothing compared to what's to come in this piece. After the overture is done, there's these ominous sound effects that sound like smoke being pumped into the air by these giant industrial smokestacks and that kind of stuff, with a little accordion-like synth or something like that, which makes it sound more French, I guess. While the first little less than 2 minutes of part 1 is just kind of a transition more than anything, it helps kind of set up the dystopian atmosphere this track is going for, and then suddenly we get these huge synth pads coming right back in to suddenly get everything driving at full force. It sounds a lot like Second Rendezvous, similarly over the top and dynamic, but even catchier. Part 1 and 2 of this track feature these synth pads very prominently and are similarly epic, although they have different melodies. And part 2 goes even more over the top than part 1. I don't know if there's any Jarre track that gets me pumped up like this particular section does. The final part of Industrial Revolution is a lot slower, reprises some of the other melodies from the previous 2 parts, with some kind of male choirs in the background, again creating that heavy, smoky, dystopian atmosphere. While admittedly the track probably could have easily ended after part 2, this is an enjoyable and well-executed outro as well, as I'm just wowed by the impressiveness of this piece, having enjoyed every second of it. We're then, unfortunately, interrupted by London Kid, a generic instrumental 80s pop rock track that feels painfully dated and attached to its time. These, like, Seinfeld-y bassline synths I swear I've heard in a million different 80s tunes, and the drums that just sound like Phil Collins in the Air Tonight stuff that I've totally become cliche at this point. Even has some weak generic guitar solos, yay! Sorry Shadows fans. I don't know if I'd even consider this track all that bad out of context, it's just kind of really. But especially having to follow up that amazing 16-minute piece which preceded it, the result here is a disappointing buzzkill. But on the second side of the album, we make quite the impressive recovery with the title track. While it's similarly incredibly 80s, it still has its charm to it. Almost sounds a little Giorgio-esque in certain parts. The Seinfeld-y bass lines come in other parts, but there's also like an Arabic vocal solo, and these computerized voices coming in to list off various concepts and words and then repeat them with the word no in front. Freedom. No freedom. Choice. No choice. Employment. No employment. Change. No change. TV. No TV. Sex. No sex. Didn't need to include that one. And finally the beat cuts out and revolution! I feel like this track was almost going for something profound, but the result is closer to something like Zoologology. It's just kinda silly at the end of the day, but it's still a lot of fun to listen to. Oh, but I gotta talk about the fact that there's 2 different versions of this particular track. And the main difference is in the intro. In the original version, this track started out with this Turkish flute sound, just playing a bit of a solo, sounding kinda lonely until the track actually starts up. I'm used to listening to this version with the flute, but I have my problems with it. Namely that the intro doesn't prepare you for what you're about to get, and if I'm going to be brutally honest, the flute in this track sounds a little Titanic-y. It is an interesting inclusion, but recently I discovered that more recent versions of the album, there's a different live version of this track, retitled Revolutions, with the flute intro removed entirely and replaced with a string section, because apparently the guy who played the flute on the original was sampled, and he wasn't too happy with his inclusion on the album, and he sued to have himself removed. So this version replaces it, and I've seen other people who prefer that version, but actually, I prefer this version now, with the strings. I think the strings are better integrated in the track than the flutes. They provide better build-up and make it easier to take the track seriously. All my nitpicks with this track and its different versions aside, this is still a major highlight on the album and my second favorite cut here. When I first heard the album as a high schooler, this was the one that initially left a stronger impression on me than even Industrial Revolution did. Then after this track, we get 2 pretty decent instrumentals. There's Tokyo Kid, which has a bit of a jazzier and more mysterious bend to it, with some trumpets. It's a slightly more subtle track. I like it. Adds some nice flavor there. And Computer Weekend is kind of cheesy, has a generic chord progression, but it puts a smile on my face. Just some cheerful synth strings over ocean sound effects and another melody that sounds like some synth imitating a voice almost. Meow, 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 meow. Except imagine that an octave higher because my voice can't go up there. Meow, beep. I tried. Yeah, this is a very cheerful and happy track that I half want to write off as corny, but I can't help but smile at it. It's too harmless, and it's just a nice little listen. September, on the other hand, oof, speaking of corny, and it really shouldn't have been. This track is dedicated to a South African anti-apartheid activist, Dulcie September, who was assassinated that year, and Jarre brings in a choir of women from Mali to sing over it, which I approve of, in theory. But first of all, this track, like Computer Weekend, is incredibly happy, to the point of corniness and got that peace on earth, everything will be okay feel to it. Obviously, me of all people calling something corny should really be saying something. If I had known this was a tribute to someone who had recently passed away at the time, I wouldn't have been able to guess. And second of all, the female choir brought on to this track sounds less like a group of African women proud of their heritage, and more like a chorus of 9-year-old boys singing that na 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 taunt song. Oh, and did I mention that the melody of this track is one of the biggest earworms that Jarre has ever conceived? It takes this track, which was originally well-intentioned, had a good idea behind it, and turns it into something really annoying. Good God. I liked it a lot at first for the same reasons I liked Computer Weekend. It was just so innocently happy and it was really catchy. But this is like one of the times where Jarre's talent for coming up with catchy hooks actually worked against him. Because every time I hear it, it gets more and more grating, and it's a track that is very, very easy to get stuck in your head. Maybe it's not irritating on the level of, say, the Chemical Brothers Do It Again, but I did have to go there. I'm sorry, but Ron's piece, this ain't. And the final track, Mcgraw, or however you say that, contains these massive, slow-moving, inspirational synth orchestras. This really sounds like some overblown national anthem crossed with a wedding march. Maybe like a soundtrack to the medal ceremony scene at the end of Star Wars. It's, a bit much for me, honestly. Kinda, overwrought. I don't know, I've also kinda always hated my own country's national anthem, so hearing this isn't really that fun for me either. Personally, a bit of a meh ending for me. So yeah. That's Revolutions, and it's all over the freaking map. Both in the sense that it's sonically emulating places around the world, and in the sense that it's really inconsistent quality-wise. Industrial Revolution is a masterpiece, Revolutions, and Computer Weekend are both really fun to listen to if a bit corny at points. Tokyo Kid makes for some nice, more subtle flavor, I guess, but London Kid is generic as hell. September is well-intentioned but unintentionally annoying, and Mcgraw feels like it's trying to fill me with national pride that is just never gonna happen. Maybe that would have been easier if I were French and or lived in 1988. I don't know. I'm very conflicted on this album. It's probably one of the lower-ranked Jarre projects, but it's also one of my most listened to ones. I certainly put it on much more frequently than Magnetic Fields or even Rendezvous, because the good moments on this album are just that freaking good. I think if I could cut out the last 2 tracks in London Kid, I'd have me a short but really solid and satisfying project. And I think I'll still have to recommend Revolutions for those best moments. I think I just slightly edge this out over Magnetic Fields. This just gets much more of a visceral reaction out of me, and even 3 tracks I don't like aren't outright terrible, just kind of meh. Even September, for as irritating as it is, it's too well-intentioned and innocent for me to truly hate on it. I guess in the end it's just another solid enough Jarre project, even if not evenly solid throughout its runtime. 'Cause as spotty as it is, it keeps me coming back to it, so I guess I'm overall feeling 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.